This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Today is Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, and I'm Lee Bortons, and today we have with us Kathy Denisi, our grammar strand writer for Classical Conversations Multimedia, and she's currently a Challenge 4 director, which plays into what we're going to be talking about today. So go ahead, Jennifer, tell us about this month's show, and then I'll jump into my part of the spiel.
Okay, well, this is our new mini series for the month of March. So we're going to look at a couple of our Challenge 4 resources that The Discoverers by Daniel Boorstin today, then Homer's epic poem, The Iliad, next week. Then we're going to take a week off for our quarterly meetings. And then we're going to finish off with the book, Improving Your Serve, which is one of our leadership books.
Great, and that's interesting. You said that we're taking off for our quarterly meetings. For listeners who don't know, we do all work together, and even though you see us on Zoom each week, we actually get together in person and talk to each other as often as we can too. So it'll be good to see you. So if anyone wants to see anything else that we've been talking about, you can access all our past episodes on my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or you can visit my website, leebortons.com, where the previous 2 years podcasts are archived, as well as the books read, links to our sponsor, Classical Conversations books.com, so you can purchase the books, as well as what's upcoming in the rest of 2025. So we try to be very organized because there's just so many good books in the world, and we want to talk about all of them. So I appreciate anybody joining us, and I just hope that that's helpful to you.
Yes, that's so true. There are so many good books, and today's book is one of them. And before I ask you my normal question, I just want to share that my copy that I use when I am directing Challenge 4, or my students use, was my grandfather's copy of this book. So it's very special to me because my paternal grandparents were readers and they loved history. And so this is a book I inherited when they passed away. So it's always precious to me when I open it up. So Lee, why did you choose this book for our curriculum?
Because your grandfather read it. I didn't even know that till just now. Yeah, so I read this book, and I used to think I was going to be a history major before I became aerospace engineer. So I had piles and piles of history books, and this had been one of my favorite reads in my late teens, because from a historical aspect, is one of the few books I stumbled upon that was super readable, interesting, as well as it talked about the history of science almost more than the history of just people themselves. So the book was intriguing to me, and I wanted it to be a book that my children read, and so having them in the curriculum, that's what happened. But I'd like to take a minute to do something I don't normally do, and to share why I love this book so much by telling you a couple of things about the table of contents. So the first book one in the book is called Time. And just to be able to spend 72 pages thinking about what if we didn't know how to measure time? How would the world be different? So the history of time is there. Then the Earth and the Seas is the next book. And listen, the first part of it is called The Geography of the Imagination. And then you go on to part 7 of that section, and it's called The American Surprise. And I'm so happy Daniel picked that title, because people think you plan to make money and that profit comes from, big edicts from on high from CEOs, and it absolutely does not. It's the surprise of innovation and excitement of new things, as well as the ability to spend time doing things we want to do versus what we don't want to do. Is what always excites me about economics and the free market. And so here we get, Daniel has that same kind of attitude about it. See, I even call him Daniel, Mr. Boorstin. And then we go on nature, and what's the first part called under nature? Seeing the invisible. Does that sound like seeing the unseen in our math curriculum? And then we move on to book 4 on society. And the first section is called Widening the Communities of Knowledge. So 2 things I love, knowledge and communities. So the book is just a great capstone book for Challenge 4 for all the curriculum the students have been reading the last 11 years, but they don't know it till they get there. So I'm hoping that people will see through me go through the table of contents that we really are trying to make Challenge 4 a place where they can go, huh, I kind of knew that, but now that I'm thinking on a more of adult level, I can integrate it into a Christian worldview. So that's why it's in the book, in the curriculum. I just love all the topics.
Yeah, and I will say the students do too. I'm sure that we're all going to share some stories, but since you brought up the table of contents, my students were absolutely fascinated last year about talking about time and measuring time differently from how we measure it now down to the nanosecond, and how their lives would be different, and whether it's been a good thing or a bad thing to divide up time into so many increments. And then they started having philosophical conversations about God's relationship to time, and then they got to the geography part, and were just captivated because they had spent all that time way back when they were 12 drawing the world, and now they were hearing about the men who made that drawing possible. And so it's a great book for sparking their imagination and their conversations. So all right. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Daniel Boorstin. Hopefully Tim's going to get to the fact that he does have a connection, a little bit of a connection to Oklahoma. But anyway, he is a fascinating writer. He is a very prolific thinker. He's written more than 20 books, and they're not short books. So they're big books. Yeah. So he's written one called The Creators that's kind of a companion to The Discoverers, but he is not a Christian, was not a Christian. So talk to us about him, Tim, and how we use this book in light of that.
Yeah, well, it's funny, Lee, you and I went on opposite paths, I think. I started off as an engineering major and then ended up as a history major. So different paths, same destination. Funny how that works, isn't it? So Daniel Boorstin was born in 1914 and only died in 2004, which I know for some of our maybe younger listeners seems like a long time ago, but for most of us does not. Um, and yeah, he had a very prolific writing career. He was an academic, and but also did some really amazing things. From 1969 to 1973, he was the director of the National Museum of History and Technology at the Smithsonian. Um, which must be an amazing job. I mean, come on, who wouldn't want to work there? And then in 1974, he received the Pulitzer Prize in History, and then he was appointed the 12th Librarian of the United States Congress and served in that capacity from 1975 to 1987. So he was sort of at the middle of national academics for quite a long time. Um, I think we appreciate him uh, this again, despite a different worldview, since he was not a Christian, um, because he was as a young man, he was active in the Communist Party, but as he read and learned, he realized that that was foolishness, and he became a political conservative. And one of the really foremost thinkers of this thing called consensus history, which is the idea that it's not revolutions and differences or wars of opinions that make the difference in what we are and who we are as a nation, but instead it's sort of that central core of the things that we agree on that are what make us what we are. He talks about a lot of different things in his books, which again he tends to be very um, topical history writer, which maybe Lee is why you enjoy him so much, rather than focusing in on one person or one era or one place. He tends to write these sort of sweeping surveys of history and primarily American history. He wrote a book called The Image, and in that he writes a lot about shifts in American culture in the 20th century, primarily due to advertising, where he bemoans the fact that reproductions and simulations and appearances become more important to people than the things that are real and true. And that's certainly something that's important to us as classical conversations, as classical Christian educators. We want our students to see past the appearances and into what is true and real and enduring. So So again, though Borston isn't necessarily wholly aligned with our worldview, he has a lot to say that should provoke us to some good deep thinking, even while we can be a little bit critical of some of the things that he makes claims about, or some of the way that he treats some of the things that we think are so important.
Yeah. And I also wanted to point out that it is Challenge 4. And one of the things that my students really appreciated were some of the assignments where they were asked to investigate his bias and to evaluate it and to think about what we learned from people who that we might not agree with on every point, and also how to be whether or not it's possible to write an unbiased history. And those are good conversations for them to be having. So that was last year for me, Kathy, but it's this year for you. And I know you're getting to have a lovely group of students and you're getting to have all kinds of great conversations about this book. So why don't you give us a peek into those conversations with your group of Challenge 4 students?
Yeah, I do have a great group of Challenge 4 students. They are way smarter than I am. We have some really good conversations. Uh, as all of you know, the Challenge 4 theme is leadership, and our students are practicing leadership by leading these conversations. I've found that my students often begin with naming and definition and circumstance, which is good pedagogy there. It helps invite everybody into the conversation and remind us what we read sometimes. Who did we read about this week? What do you remember? But then they tend to move on to some deeper questions. And I came up with 3 conversations that really stood out to me this year. We recently talked about Charles Darwin, and the students knew about him. They had studied him, I think, in Challenge B. And we started discussing the people that influenced his thinking, like Lyell and Wallace and some others. We found it, they and I both found it really interesting to think of the relationship of these thinkers that came before, the influence of the peers that he was dealing with, and then how all of those ideas affect us today. So that was one of our really good conversations recently. In another one of our discussions, the student leader asked, does our view of God change with scientific discovery? And so we discussed that quite a bit, and they decided, yes, it does. We see more of God's greatness as we learn about discovery. We talked about how discovery itself is led by wonder and curiosity and study. It's not conquering creation, it's learning more about God's creation. And we talked about how our finite minds compare and relate things, and that just increases our knowledge of God and His creation. So I thought that was super, super good. And then that led us right into what you were saying, Jennifer, and that we talked about the worldview of the author versus our Christian worldview. We talked about whether we are exalting man or are we exalting God in our discussions, in our studies, in the things we're doing. And then a third conversation that was actually leading into some impromptu speeches that we did was just about the book itself, the style of the book itself. And I think the question was, does it give a good portrayal of history, a good sufficient portrayal of history? And it was so interesting to me to hear the students discuss this and the kind of ideas they came up with, because a lot of them really appreciated learning more of the background and circumstances behind these discoveries and the discoverers. They liked that it gave a broader base of information, because he talks about, the China and the Arabs and their views on discovery. We talked about how isolated the Chinese tended to be because they had a different idea about scientific discovery. And then that led into talking about how the author makes choices about what topics and people to include. Some of the kids wanted to have a bigger picture of Columbus because that's who they'd heard about all these years, right? But it was nice how the author wove a story together to lead up to what Lee was talking about in the beginning, which was the accidental surprise discovering America.
Oh, that's great. I want to pick up a couple of your threads. I do love, as you talked about Darwin, I was thinking oddly in Challenge 2 yesterday, we talked about Darwin, but in a different context, we were talking about Out of the Silent Planet and how Lewis was reacting to some of the social Darwinists who thought that there were certain categories of people who were lesser and therefore could be experimented on, and how Lewis was trying to preserve the humanity and dignity of every human being. And so it is fun to see how over the years you keep coming back and weaving the threads together. And that's one thing that makes Challenge 4 especially precious, is getting to reflect back on all of that. And then I really liked what you had to say about, just his perspectives and bias, because one thing that my students discussed is that sometimes he came across as sounding biased because Christians had to have their perceptions of the physical world altered by new discoveries, but that didn't invalidate their theology, right? That those were separate. So sometimes they made errors. Not that we don't make theological errors too, but what I'm saying is they never found anything that discredited the Bible. Usually what was happening is that some view that they held about God's physical cosmos is what was changed. And that's okay. None of us should be afraid of that, because it's not going to contradict truth. So
I want to just congratulate you, Kathy, because you made a couple of comments I thought were interesting that I won't spend time on, but the one that you just said so excitedly, that the kids know more than you do and how much you enjoyed Challenge 4, because you're not going in there trying to tell them this is what you have to believe. This is what you have to know. You're trying to discover them and find out what do they know and believe, and to guide that conversation. And that, you're trying to really be a tutor mentor more than a teacher, because you only have them for one day 30 times a year. Their parents have them the rest of the time. And so I just appreciated your attitude and I'm being excited about that rather than frightened by it. I'm sure it makes you a great tutor.
It's definitely fun.
Mhm.
Love tutoring Challenge 4.
yeah, you get to have all kinds of discoveries yourself just from listening to the students. So it's a great year. Well, another historian that many of us are familiar with and appreciate his work is David McCullough, and he's written a lot about American history, especially in recent years. So a lot of people know about him from John Adams, which was made into a miniseries, but he has many, many American history books. And he did a review of Worston's books and said that it is a sumptuous, totally engaging panorama. No one who reads it will look at the chronicle of human ingenuity in the same way again. What do you guys think about that review?
I like the words he uses. I don't get to say sumptuous with books and science very often.
I think he summarized really well what Lee introduced us to in the very beginning of this episode.
Yeah, that huge panorama of what he talks about. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a giant book. I mean, it covers a lot of different topics and through giant sweeps of history. I mean, going all the way back to the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians up to the very modern, um, around the world. So it is a panorama is a good word for it, right? It's you stand in one spot and circle and look around, and it's all around you everywhere. What he's talking about. I think it's interesting that he calls it a chronicle of human ingenuity. Again, it's one of those like worldview differences that we might say it's man's discoveries of what God had made, but here McCullough calls it human ingenuity, the focus on what man has done rather than what God has made. And I think that's where we would find maybe some room to quibble or balance out that perspective.
Yeah, Kathy and Jennifer made it sound like they give their students plenty of room to talk about that. In fact, the subtitle for the book, The Discoverers, is along the lines of the journey to know the world and man's journey to know the world and himself. And of course, we don't believe our purpose is to know me and to make me known. It's to know God and to make him known. But on the other hand, once you get to there where you really are seeking God, you do find out who you are, and you do find out the hope and the innovation and the opportunities that he's going to provide for you as you pursue that human ingenuity, those talents that he gave you. So I just think it's a lovely way to be able to talk to the children, because we don't want them to be cynics. We don't want them to think only Christians do everything right. We absolutely don't believe that or think that it's true. And this book is such a intriguing way to ask those conversations about what's the difference between serving yourself and serving other people. Because Daniel Boorstin admires people who served others.
Yeah. Well, and it's also just, I think it gives them, it's great. So it is a great capstone in the sense that you get to look back and have lots of continued conversations from the previous years, but it's also a great look forward because they are about to go out and discover more about the specific mission that God has given them. And I think it's because it's so celebratory of these human discoveries, it gives them great hope about where they're headed next, because God does have things for them to discover and ways he wants them to serve humanity. And the way Borston writes leads you to believe that there are many more things to be discovered. We never want our students to think that, there's nothing left for them to conquer, that they have plenty to go out and discover and serve. So it's exciting.
Yes. Makes me think of Peter Thiel, who's a very popular science writer, the guy that started PayPal, Elon Musk's friend, and how he talks about the last 50 years, just because of the general decline of all kinds of things in our culture, young people have not been taught that there are new worlds to discover. Right? We haven't heard a lot of news in the last 20 years about sea exploration or space exploration. And so that's one thing that's exciting about our current culture is people are talking about it again. So.
Yeah. And medical discoveries, which is part of his sweeping panorama too. So lots of scope for their imaginations in this one.
Oh.
Well, I think it's time for our break, Lee.
Okay. So once again, I'd like to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, and remind you that's where all the books we discuss can be purchased. And we have the entire 2023-2025 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC book site as well as to my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons. I treat that as an archive. There's all kinds of things on my YouTube channel that have nothing to do with anything else and might be fun to stumble upon to learn more about classical conversations. And so next week, we're going to talk about, I know very many people in our circle's favorite, the Iliad. And I can't wait to talk about not just how that book is part of CC, but how it's affected our culture overall. I don't think people really know how important the book that is. So I look forward to next week's discussion.
Yeah, it will be very fun. It's always good to get into a little poetry with Homer. So now's the time when we're going to turn and read some passages of the book. And we don't always get to hear an author's direct commentary on their own work, but it sure is nice when we get it. It isn't the last word always, because sometimes they will record things that maybe even they didn't intend, but it is a great place to start to hear what he thinks that his purpose is in writing the book. So Kathy, do you want to read Borston's personal note to the reader for us?
Yeah, I sure can. And we read this right at the beginning of the year. We read this together in community. He says, "My hero is man, the discoverer. The world we now view from the literate West, the vistas of time, the land and the seas, the heavenly bodies and our own bodies, the plants and animals, history and human societies past and present, had to be opened for us by countless Columbuses. In the deep recesses of the past, they remain anonymous. As we come closer to the present, they emerge into the light of history, a cast of characters as varied as human nature. Discoveries became episodes of biography, unpredictable as the new worlds as the new worlds the discoverers opened to us. The obstacles to discovery, the illusions of knowledge, are also part of our story. Only against the forgotten backdrop of the received common sense and myths of their time can we begin to sense the courage, the rashness, the heroic and imaginative thrusts of the great discoverers. They had to battle against the current facts and dogmas of the learned. I've tried to recapture those illusions about the earth, the continents, and the seas before Columbus and Balboa, Magellan, and Captain Cook, about the heavens before Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, about the human body before Paracelsus and Vesalius, sorry, I probably didn't pronounce those right, and Harvey, about plants and animals before Ray and Linnaeus, Darwin, and Pasteur, about the past before Petrarch and Winckelmann, Thompson and Schliemann, about wealth before Adam Smith and Keynes, about the physical world and the atom before Newton and Dalton and Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, and Einstein. I have asked some unfamiliar questions. Why didn't the Chinese discover Europe or America? Why didn't the Arabs circumnavigate Africa and the world? Why did it take so long for people to learn that the Earth goes around the sun? Why did people begin to believe that there are species of plants and animals? Why were the facts of prehistory and the discovery of the progress of civilization so slow in coming?
That passage definitely gives you the sweeping panorama, doesn't it? We've got geography, astronomy, anatomy, physics.
And lots of people, some that my students had heard of and a lot that they had not heard of. And of course, this book is not a textbook. It's not going to give you a list of facts. It's going to weave a story and weave these people in so that you see this broad picture of how things came about. I just love the way it does that.
I love it that he gives questions,
Hmm.
because I mean, those are what we want to know. And we have our own questions as well. But it's wonderful to hear that he didn't just like, well, here's my pile of facts. I'm gonna arrange them and tell them to you. But he started with his own questions of why did that happen or why didn't that happen? And sought answers to discover from his own questions.
You muted. You muted.
Oh, you're still muted.
Muted.
There you go.
I was looking at the text. I think something that differentiates a book from fiction versus from question. Sorry again. The difference between a textbook written from a historical perspective versus the questions that he asked makes it so that you can be wrong. In other words, I'm not reading through his book to find out the right answer to everything. I'm listening to a man put some logic together, some facts together, and come up with some suppositions, and then seeing if they play out and could possibly be true. And I think that's something we want our older children to learn how to do. We spend so much time with the grammar when they're young because they have to have that. Otherwise, they can't get to that. Like they don't know those people he just listed. But that's something we struggle with math studies. Math studies are an exploration of how do you discuss the world? What is the language and the conversation that describes the way the world works? But we've been trained to thinking you say 2 + 2 = 4 and you're a mathematician. So this book does for history studies and science studies what I want to have done for both Latin, which Kathy's great at and maybe could address, and math studies. That it's the question that takes you down to the discovery rather than the just the ability to be a Paul Parrot for your whole life. And we, of course, love the Paul Parrot stage in classical conversations, but we recognize it's a beginning thing. It's not where we're heading anybody towards.
Yeah, one thing I appreciated about the questions too is we talk a lot about the common topic of circumstance and asking what's possible. And in order to be a discoverer, you have to ask what's possible. And so Lee and I went to a conference a couple weeks ago in London where they were talking about what happens when a branch of science stops asking questions about what's possible and they stop looking for new theories. And so I was struck by that again here where he asks those negative questions. Why didn't the Chinese discover Europe or America? Well, it's probably because they're not asking questions about what's possible. And so that made me think about even today that can happen to us if we're not asking what's possible and what's next. What's next in physics? What's next in biology? So, all right. Well, we're gonna have to move on for the sake of time to our next one. So this is our next interesting passage. We usually have a hard time thinking about changes in time. So, like for example, Lee and I just went and had to adjust 6 hours of time difference, or we have daylight savings time where we struggle with changing by 1 hour. And then, there were times in history, like during the French Revolution, where they tried to change the week from 7 days to 10 days when they found out that was really, really hard for people. And they went back to the 7-day week. But Borston gives us a glimpse into how some of this came about, our thoughts about time. And he sort of has to give a nod to God's creation here. So Lee, do you want to read this one for us?
Sure. Our own Western 7-day week, one of the most arbitrary of our institutions, came into being from popular need and spontaneous agreement, not from a law or the order of any government. How did it happen? Why? When? Why a 7-day week? The The ancient Greeks, it seemed, had no week. Romans lived by an 8-day week. Farmers who worked in the fields for 7 days came to town for the 8th day, market day, or Nundinie. Kathy can pronounce that later. This was a day of rest and festivity, a school holiday, the occasion for public announcements and for entertaining friends. When and why the Romans picked on 8 days and why they eventually changed to a 7-day week is not clear. The number 7 almost everywhere has had a special charm. The Japanese found 7 gods of happiness. Rome was set on 7 hills. The ancients counted 7 wonders of the world, and medieval Christianity enumerated 7 deadly sins. The Roman change from 8 to 7 seems not to have been accomplished by any official act. By the early 3rd century by the early 3rd century AD, Romans were living with the 7-day week. There must have been some popular new ideas afloat. One of these was the idea of the Sabbath, which appears to have come to Rome through the Jews. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, says the 4th commandment. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor the cattle, nor the stranger that is within the gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Exodus 28-11. Every week, God's creatures reenacted his creation. The Jews made their week a memorial, too, of their liberation from slavery. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commandeth thee to keep the Sabbath day. Deuteronomy 5:15. So this is one of the places where I feel like we can, open up with the students and say, why is it arbitrary? I would say it wasn't arbitrary at all, but maybe I'm wrong, and Borsing will prove me wrong.
It was interesting. One of the things my students wanted to talk about in this section is how some of our contemporary conventions have allowed us to stretch times in ways that maybe we shouldn't. And so we spent a lot of time talking about whether or not it's possible to multitask. And if it is that good for you? And is it good for you to break up your day into seconds and nanoseconds? And do we anymore keep the Sabbath? And if so, what does that look like? So we had great conversations about this section alone.
I think it's one of those things that as a Christian, we can say this is where we've discovered something that's true about what God made and how he made it and how he made us, that he made us with regular cycles, right? I mean, some of them are obvious. The night and day cycle is very clear to us that we generally sleep at night and are up and about and working during the day. But the 7-day week is not a natural one. We have other base systems, Lee, that are much more common. Base 5, base 10 because of our digits that make it easy to count, or the Babylonians had base 6 and base 60 systems that leave us with our degrees and hours of the day. But base 7 is not really a thing. 7's an interesting number, but why would we have a 7-day week? And again, I think even here, Borston can't get away from the fact that God made it, and he made us to be harmonic with what he made. And he made the 7-day week.
My students have trouble even imagining something other than a 7-day week. We talked about, what if there were no weeks? What if we just worked for 30 days? When do you take a rest? It seems super obvious to have a 7-day week. But then when you think about an ancient civilization that maybe has lost their knowledge of God, because I think everybody at one time had knowledge of God, but then they lost it somewhere along the way. And how would you make up a week? I mean, like the Romans tried to make up the 8-day week, or was it the French?
8
One of
days
them.
for the Romans, 10 for the French.
Romans, yeah. 10, yeah. It just makes no sense to us.
Yeah. Oh, fun. Such fun conversations. Okay, well, let's go back. Speaking of tying threads together, a few months ago, we looked at both Nancy Piercy and Doug Wilson, and we talked about their views on science and faith and how those can be reconciled. And Borson doesn't exactly try to do that and reconcile those, but he does give a bigger historical view of science than what we typically do in our modern perspective, which is just limiting valuable science to what's right now. So, Tim, why don't you read this one for us and we'll go back to this idea again.
Yeah, and this is again something that Lee referenced back at the beginning of our episode, that he gives backstory so we can evaluate and understand things in the world of science better too. So he writes, to understand the paradoxical beginnings of modern science, we must recall that this beautiful symmetrical scheme, much ridiculed in the modern classroom, actually served very well for both astronomer and layman. It described the heavens precisely as they looked and fitted the observations and calculations made with the naked eye. The scheme's simplicity, symmetry, and common sense made it seem to confirm countless axioms of philosophy, theology, and religion, and it actually performed some functions of a scientific explanation, for it fitted the available facts, was a reasonably satisfactory device for prediction, and harmonized with the accepted view of the rest of nature. In addition, it aided the astronomer's memory with a convenient, coherent model, replacing the list of miscellaneous facts then known about the heavens. More than that, while this much maligned geocentric or Ptolemaic scheme provided the layman with a clear picture to carry around in his head, it helped the astronomer reach out to the unknown. Even for the adventurous sailor and the navigator, it served well enough, as Columbus proved. The modern advance to Copernicus's heliocentric system would be hard to imagine if the geocentric system had not been there available for revision. Copernicus would not change the shape of the system, he simply changed the location of the bodies. Of course, the traditional geocentric system of Aristotle and Ptolemy and so many others over the centuries had its own weaknesses. For example, the system did not explain the irregularities observed in the motions of the planets. But the layman hardly noticed these irregularities, and anyway, they seemed adequately described by the supposed movement of each planet within its own special ethereal sphere.
Because we don't spend any time outdoors at night anymore because we have electricity and heated homes. Like that, this doesn't have the impact it would to say a cowboy in Wyoming who has, or a shepherd in Israel who's out all night long and actually understands how little things, because they're so far away, look different come in the Copernican versus the Ptolemaic model. We have no sense of what he just read.
Yeah.
I think also we don't have the patience. It would
Mhm.
take, how many years would it take to discover some of these movements and to study them?
Mhm. Well, one thing that's
One
kind
thing
of
I do.
interesting you can do with the students is you can see the stars move in 2 hours. So if you go out at say 9:30 at night and then go back and then kind of map it out and then go back out same spot look up at 11:30, those stars will have moved. So there's some things you can teach them, but not a lot, like you just said.
Philosophically, one thing that I think is important about this is that he gives a lot of credit to the previous model and why it worked and why it lasted so long, which I really appreciate because we have too great of a tendency as humans to look back in scorn at the old model because we're so sophisticated and we have adopted the new model. And of course, the new model must be better than the old model. So I appreciate the credit that he gives to it. What did work about it? Why did it last so long? Why was it sufficient? To the needs that they had. I think that's a very gracious approach.
Yes. And I love the fact that he acknowledges that the wrong answer that the Ptolemaic system had was the scientific answer. That this wasn't some myth or some religious bozo out there saying things about the heavens. This was the accepted scientific consensus for 1,000 years. And um, and we have a great hubris in our modern era to think that we have the answers. And with the pace with the pace of advancement in understanding of these things, I imagine instead of 1,000 years for the Ptolemaic system or 500 years for the Copernican system, it'll probably be 20 years before our system is totally proved wrong, and our children scoff at how little we knew.
It's going to happen. Yeah, I think Nancy Pearcey is the one that points out when Galileo and the various controversies were going on about the change over to the model, that the bishops and the archdiocese and the people that from the church that get all the negative press, basically the response was, so what that the math works better. Math isn't the only thing in the world. What about the philosophy and epistemology and the theology and the other things you need to consider? So they had a broader worldview, and it took more years because science wasn't their God. Science was actually kind of new, so it took them longer to accept things, but that didn't mean they were wrong. So Jennifer, I agree with you in this, in giving them the credit, especially when it was something that was so hard to see.
Yeah.
It's kind of like being mad at doctors for not washing their hands.
Right.
They couldn't see it.
Right. Right. And I appreciated what you said too about, I think that we are at a place where we are starting to see, we had a lot of years, several hundred, of accepting only empirical evidence. Well, that's also not the norm in the history of the world. There were all kinds of sources of evidence, right? There was divine knowledge from theology. There was philosophy. There are lots. There's common sense. So I think I'm excited that we're at a point too where we're looking at different kinds of authorities as we craft our theories. So. All right. Well, we're going to have to probably read our last passage with very little commentary because we're almost out of time. But we've talked about how Borston loves man the discoverer, but he doesn't look at the history of discoveries with rose-tinted glasses. They weren't always made by people who had the best motives. They weren't always made by people who wanted to enlighten others or share their profits. And so I will read about this, and then you guys can make quick comments before we close out. And I don't know how to pronounce this either, so we'll see. When the Portuguese pilot Pero d'Alenquer, who had sailed with Diaz and Gama, returned home, he boasted at court that he knew how to take any ship, not only a caravel, to the coast of Guinea and back. King John II publicly rebuked him, then took him aside to explain privately that he simply wanted to discourage foreign interlopers from profiting by the Portuguese experience. Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors did everything in their power to establish and preserve a monopoly over the commerce with their newly discovered coasts of Africa. This meant not letting out word about where the places were and how to reach them. When King Manuel developed his plans for a pepper monopoly in 1504, he ordered that all the navigating information be kept secret. It is impossible to get a chart of the voyage, an Italian agent complained after Cabral's return from India, because the king has decreed the death penalty for anyone sending one abroad. This policy was not easy to enforce since the Portuguese kings had to rely on foreigners like Vespucci to do their work of discovery. In 1481, the Portuguese Cortes petitioned King John II to exclude foreigners, especially Genoese and Florentines, from settling in the country because they habitually stole the royal secrets as to Africa and the islands. Yet a few years later, the young Genoese Christopher Columbus went on his voyage to help the Portuguese build their fort at Sao Jorge de Mina on the Guinea coast. And it was a Fleming, Fernaldolmo, who King John sent with Estreito even before Columbus to seek islands in the Western Ocean. Still, the Portuguese conspiracy of silence was effective, at least for a while, until the middle of the 16th century. Other countries seeking information about the Portuguese seafaring commerce to Asia had to rely on scraps gathered from ancient writers, casual overland travelers, occasional turncoat sailors, and spies. Wow.
GPS killed all that.
Yeah, because this sounds exactly like the modern pharma company system, right? Of discoveries and keeping secrets until someone ferrets them out and sells them to foreigners or some other corporation that reproduces it, and right, and the cycle continues. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just what trade secrets are you keeping?
And go ahead. No,
Oh,
you go.
I was going to say, I was thinking about how good it is to read a passage like that. And in community, sometimes we'll do that. We'll read a passage and then develop questions from that. And that whole idea of conspiracy of silence, I would say, why does he call it a conspiracy? And was that the right thing for the Portuguese to do? Is it right today, like you were saying, Tim, to keep these corporate secrets? Is it right for a country? This just leads into all kinds of great questions.
Yeah,
Good.
absolutely. And this idea of secrets, and also he says they had to rely on scraps gathered from ancient writers. He chases some fascinating little bunny trails throughout the book where there were these myths and stories from ancient writers, and some surprise discoveries were made because people were chasing those, thinking they were true stories. And so we can credit those discoveries to chasing something that wasn't in itself true, but boy, we found a lot because of it. So.
Well, once again, it was wonderful to be with you. I can't wait to talk about the Iliad with you, because we have another adventurer in that book. And to remind all of you that probably the best adventure is right smack in your family. And why don't you share some stories about how you and your husband got to where you are in life and what your parents and grandparents were like. Make sure those children ask good questions and that you're there with an interesting story like Daniel Borston. See you guys next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Bye.